Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Namaste. Welcome to this session of the Weekly Dialogues. And today I have the one and only R. Jagannathan, whom you know better as the Jaggi or just Jaggi. How are you, sir?
I'm well. Namaskar, namaste. Dhanyawad to calling me here. Thank you very much.
And welcome once again to the Jaipur Dialogues. I remember you came here in 2018 and 2017.
Yeah.
And that was a very well appreciated address that you made to our people here in the Jaipur Dialogues. We have grown exponentially on the online platform over the last 6 months or so. Now
Great.
we have a subscriber base of over 40,000 already, and it's going quite fast. I think the corona pandemic has come as a blessing in disguise to us, because we can find speakers at their home and we can get them on. So that's been a big plus. So, sir, we are going to talk to you about a wonderful piece which you wrote on 31st December 1919. 2019.
Right.
And it was called Mission 2020. And you did a very thorough analysis of the Hindu attitudes. And you mentioned that it was time that the Hindus started converting others. They started becoming missionaries and not just forestalling attacks on them, not just be defensive. And I agree with you to quite some extent. In fact, I often give the example of Constantinople. You've seen what is happening in Hagia Sophia right now.
Yes.
I gave the example that for nearly 800 years, starting from 732, and nearly 800 years, Islam kept attacking, and the Byzantines, they kept defending. But ultimately, in 1498, it gave way. And once it gave way, there was no going back. And it is, I think, very well symbolized by this signal regression that we've seen, that Hagia Sophia has gone back to being a mosque.
That's right.
Sir, I would like you to talk about this a little bit, and then I will also touch upon those 5 bad ideas and a few bad ideas of others also.
Right.
There are other few ideas which I've also flagged. So we'll also discuss those bad ideas that you flagged. So this is the article that I'm talking about.
Yes.
Viewers, you can have a look, and I will give you a link also in the comment section. I'll pin it so that anybody who wants to look at this article can go back and have a look. So, sir, why do you think that it is time that Hinduism became a missionary faith?
Yeah, let's start with the philosophical basis for why I'm saying that. It's not necessarily rooted in Hinduism. It basically, I say, in nature, there is no steady state. You are either expanding or contracting. You're either growing or you're regressing, right? So the steady states that we talk about, where nothing changes and it's a short-term equilibrium. Sooner or later, you have to either expand or contract. So in the case of Hinduism, we have been in contractionary mode and defensive mode for a very long time. Just a little while back, you mentioned Hagia Sophia. Now, why did the Byzantine Empire, which was defensive for centuries, suddenly lose out? Because the relentlessness of the attack of Islam was so continuous that at some point, sooner or later, defenses break down. Because to be defensive, you have to win 100% of the time. To be offensive, you only have to win once, and you have actually defeated the other. So the fundamental thing in having a very defensive mindset is that you are ultimately programmed to lose, which means that unless you think offensive, unless you think of taking the battle to somebody else's territory, you are going to keep defending something that's ultimately going to lose. So from this philosophical perspective, I'm saying if Hinduism does not seek to expand, it will wither away slowly. And as we are already seeing the numbers, for the last century, every decade, Hindus have lost ground, and it continues to be so. And I think we may even have underestimated the level of ground we have lost, because there are a lot of conversions which are not yet getting reported in the religion data. So I think basically steady state exists only when two partners say that, see, within the Indic system, it did not matter. It was never a steady state. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, they all fought for their ideas. They quarreled over ideas, thoughts, spiritual experiences, and but they had a fundamental understanding that you don't reject the other idea just because your idea looks better right now. They borrowed from one another, they grew, they all expanded. But the Abrahamic faiths are not like that. They are binary in nature. They say either if I win, you have to lose. So there is no middle ground between that. Whereas within the Indic faiths, it's not the case. So that's the difference, which is why I think this battle is not something within the context of Indic faiths. It is with a faith which believes in a 0-1. You're either 0 or you're 1. So if they are 1, then we are 0. So you got to make sure that you battle them on their turf and take the battle to their turf.
Very well put, Jagannathan sir. But would you also like to discuss the specific narratives that have gotten into Hinduism over the last 100 years or so? Because what I think is that before the advent of Mahatma Gandhi, the martial spirit was very much alive. And from time to time, you did see people coming in, evangelizing. Even Swami Vivekananda was very upfront about the strength of the Hindu faith and why it was, if not exactly superior, but why it was better placed among all different religions. I'm deliberately using that word religion in the common term.
Right.
Otherwise, a lot of my people would come and say that, oh, you don't distinguish between religion and dharma. That's not the idea. I'm just using it in the in the common parlance. So Swami Vivekananda was there. Sri Aurobindo was very much upfront, and Sri Aurobindo was very, very critical of Mahatma Gandhi and his ways, because what he thought was that what he was advocating was probably cowardice. And not only that, Arya Samaj was a very, very upfront missionary faith, and I think they did manage to reconvert, or what they called the Shuddhi movement was very, very strong. And I think lakhs and lakhs of ex-Hindus were brought back to the fold through the Arya Samaj. However, when the Abrahamic faiths, as you said, that they are in a binary, and if they win, then you have to lose. And in that sense, an attack was carried out on Swami Siddhananda. He was murdered. And the way Mahatma Gandhi responded to that event and was almost apologetic instead of condemning that murder and defending the Hindus and Hindu-ness, what Savarkar called the Hindutva. I think that was probably the inflection point. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, it was embedded in Gandhi's philosophy, who was pacifist to the core, who bought the nonsense in the Sermon on the Mount and internalized it as his own life message. The sermon that the meek will inherit the earth was the basic idea, but no Christian faith actually follows that thought. I mean, that thing was somehow internalized by Mahatma Gandhi as his own personal philosophy. The problem with Gandhi was, you can be, as an individual, you can be a pacifist. You can be, you can say, I don't mind losing my life because this is what I believe in. But when you inflict that idea on a population, you essentially sort of destroy its internal ability to fight back. In nature, every single, even the tiny virus has the ability to fight back. You can see that with the coronavirus, which is going on, that even though we have won most battles in medical, this one tiny virus is able to fight back and give us the fight of our lives. This is what is happening, right? So if every living being actually gave up the ability to fight, it will not survive. And Mahatma Gandhi made a huge mistake when he inflicted his personal philosophy onto the whole country. And we as a people have internalized this. Arya Samaj, as you know, made a very tough effort to get back things. Even in its own small way, RSS and VHP are trying Garvapsi in a very nondescript kind of way, but not very aggressively so. But they need to do that, because if you do not do that, if you do not try to take the battle into the other person's turf, you're going to lose the war. And pacifism is wrong fundamentally, unless you're talking about two peaceful people can shake hands and say, okay, we agree to live in peace. But can you live in peace with a Pakistan or a China? What pacifism is it going to work? It's not going to work. And Mahatma Gandhi's response, not only to the murder of Shraddhanandji, but even say Bhagat Singh, or even his efforts in Noakhali, he sat there for weeks, but actually it did not change any hearts on the other side. It is only the Hindu. Finally, he gave up, and he says, if Hindus, either you have to convert or you have to flee from here. That's the message he gave to Hindus of Noakhali during the just before independence, right? So the so-called one-man peaceful army did not work even in the worst communal carnage that we saw in erstwhile to be East Pakistan. So it has not worked. And why are we still supporting this kind of failed pacifism? I don't know. Maybe apart from that Sermon on the Mount, I think the Jain philosophy, which was very strong in Gujarat, also seeped into him to some extent. But Jain philosophy is about individuals not hurting others. It's not about not fighting back anybody else. Jainism itself would not have survived if it had been so self-destructive, you know. And Ambedkar has written repeatedly that Buddhism died because it did not fight back. The minute they destroyed all the Buddhas, that was the end of Buddhism in India. When the invaders came and destroyed all the monasteries, the universities, what was left? So you can't have that kind of pacifist mindset. History has proved it. Ambedkar has said it repeatedly. Only Gandhi didn't seem to have got the message. And unfortunately, we followed the wrong guy.
Yeah, quite right. I tend to agree with you. And then there are those apologia, such as you yourself have given 5. So I'll take you through those 5 bad ideas. Say that the apology is that we have survived the last 1,000 years, so we will survive the next 1,000 too.
Yeah. So this is actually mistake thinking. I mean, you know the law of exponential growth, right? Pond fills doubles every year. So till this penultimate day, only half the pond is full. So you're saying that, look, still half of it is still left for me. So I am as big as the other guy. But the next day you're gone, because the pond, the leaves in the pond double every year. So exponential growth means, see, Islam grows through demography and intimidation. Okay. So it believes that demographically, if you change your growth rate at a certain rate, over decades, it is bound to overtake you regardless, even if not a single person converts. Okay. So basically, they work through that basis. Whereas Hinduism, which actually is rooted in knowledge and mathematics, we seem to have forgotten the compounding of growth rates, of exponential growth. And you need to understand that and internalize that. It is not about this year or next decade. I would say in 2 decades, at the current rate of growth, at least 2 more states, if not 3, will actually become Hindu minority. I am talking about Assam and Kerala. Okay. So my point is, like, I mean, are you going to allow India to be eaten up portion by portion like this? And also, for example, if you were to split Uttar Pradesh into 4 things, Western Europe, Western UP would actually be a Hindu minority state. I mean, that's what will happen. And once that happens, you're going to keep losing demographically. So I think the mistake of believing that, oh, nothing happened for 1,000 years, because the rate of change was slower in the initial period. But the rate of change is accelerating. And if you do not, you yourself do not accelerate your responses, you are going to lose this game.
Absolutely right. And then the second point that you flagged was that it is said that we give all people the freedom to follow their own ideas and faith, which means we are open and liberal. And of course, we know what liberals are like.
Yeah, I mean, we are up against one basic thing, what Karl Popper called is paradox. That
yes.
Can the tolerant afford to be tolerant with the intolerant? Huh? So, right. I mean, if Weimar Republic allowed a Hitler to rise, the Hitler destroyed the Republic, right? So the point really is, if you do not fight back against illiberal forces and make sure they are contained and narrowed down and made to shrink, they are going to eat you up alive. So this is the reality we are up against. So this business of liberalism, you be liberal with liberals, you respect those who respect you. So everything has to be reciprocal. I mean, there are 3 rules. One is called the golden rule, where you do unto others only what you want not to do. Then there is the bronze rule, which says that whatever the other guy does, make sure you do the same. That is supposed to be the most stable thing. That is, if somebody hits you, don't say he turn the other cheek, give him a slap at least. Don't be the first one to slap the other guy, but if you do it, then only you will have a stable power balance. Otherwise, you're going to be, the more you turn the other cheek, the more you are likely to lose. So that is all right in spirituality. I mean, where there is nothing to be fought except your own salvation. But when you're talking about people and the right to exist, liberalism will not survive by turning the other cheek, nor will tolerance survive by turning the other cheek. These things don't work.
No, quite right. I think it is Vidur Niti in Mahabharata. It says that krite pratikritim kuryat hinsine pratihinsinam and nacha dosham pashyami shathe shathyam samacharit. So shathe shathyam samacharit is Vidur Niti, and I agree with you, that should be carried out to the hilt. Then, of course, the third one, I think the biggest, I should say, myth or hoax or whatever, that all religions are the same. I have written a full monograph of about 7,000 words on it. So I am pretty much with you on this. So how do you like to narrate this? All religions are the same.
No, see, it is fair to say that all religions might have some aspect of the truth in them, some aspects. But the point is, they're all quite different, and they have different aspects of the truth, which is why we say ekam sat vipra baudha vadanti, right? That is, the truth may be one, but we may have different aspects of it. So the tolerant religions obviously will lose out if you think that everybody has an equal access to the truth. It is not true. It is only the open-minded who have higher access to the truth. The closed-minded do not have, because they say truth is already established. So where is the scope for further access to the truth? So the fundamental thing in Hinduism and all Indic faith is that the truth is something you have to keep seeking, and it is something. So it's fundamentally different from the other two guys. Is all the truth is already known to everybody. All you need to do is just follow what we are saying is the truth, and that is it. So obviously, anybody with an open mind will know this is nonsense. But if we keep saying this is the same thing, that somebody who says truth is already final and nothing more needs to be learned, does not know the meaning of growing knowledge, evolution, everything. So knowledge evolves, wisdom evolves, everything evolves. But somebody who's already got all the knowledge, wisdom and all has no need to regress. But they're the ones who are ruining the world. So obviously that ideology needs to be called out and defeated by a new thought process, rejuvenation of the idea of Hinduism and some of the Indic faiths that have come here. So I think all religions are certainly not the same. Some religions are just destructive of the world. Some actually can regenerate the world. So the religions that will regenerate the world need to be strengthened, and the other ones whittled down.
Yeah, absolutely right. Of course, I actually went into the fundamentals of the two major groupings, that is the Indic faiths and the Abrahamic faiths. And then I distinguished them on the fundamentals of time concepts, cyclic versus linear. Then the logic concepts, binary versus multi-valued. This is the little booklet that I have published.
Great.
And then on the question of attitude to science, that is whether you agree to falsification, which is the major attribute of science, or not. Abrahamic faiths do not admit of any falsification. The epistemology, the system of proof, where we regard the Pratyaksha Praman as the highest, and for them, the word of the book is final. And of course, then the cosmology, the eschatology, about the death, what happens in the death. And the foremost is the immanence of divine. The immanence of divine in the Indic faith is a very much a paramount philosophy. whereas immanence is blasphemy as far as the Abrahamic faiths are concerned.
Yeah,
So even
absolutely.
on the fundamental basis, all religions are absolutely not the same; they are totally opposed to each other. That's
Right.
a wonderful point that you brought out there. Then this nonsense about Hinduism will not be Hinduism and will become Hindutva if we become aggressive and we become missionary.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you could never have been grown up to about 79% of India or whatever, or in fact, nearly 100% at earlier points, if you had been a pacific and self destructive faith. And you were not just mere faith, you were also faith combined with reason. You had and science and various things. So you were an evolutionary character. When we talk about Sanatan Dharma, we are not talking about a never changing idea, but an ever changing with several constants which are helping holding the edifice up, right? So the whole point about the thing that we were always pacifist is completely wrong. We have seen a history of fighting throughout. We have seen from the time when, let's say, Buddhism and others prevailed, and you had the Adi Shankara coming and establishing in all four corners of India. Then you have right up to Shivaji and Krishnadevaraya. You have people rising all the time to actually fight for their faiths, So without that, it would not have happened. Even in today, for Tamil Nadu, who took the faith to Southeast Asia? It was Tamilians who today abuse Hindus today for no reason because of all these Periyarists. But the fact is, Hinduism went to Southeast Asia from Tamil Nadu, right? So it went from the southernmost part of India. And if you think that was a pacifist thing to do, it was not the case. We have always taken the battle to the other side, both intellectually and in terms of aggression. And this is the spirit we need to discover. And as far as the idea that Hinduism will not remain Hinduism if we do anything, actually it is not true. All religions have to evolve based on objective realities, right? Now, I'll give you an example. Like when we were playing on grass, we were at the top of the hockey world. Now the field has changed to AstroTurf. Now, if you do not change your game, you're going to lose, okay? Either you say, I'm going to dictate the turf and we are going to play only on grass, or we are going to play like Wimbledon. I mean, they will say we will play on grass. So different kinds of players tend to win Wimbledon than the guys who tend to win in this thing. So when the field has changed, you've got to change your tactics. So you have to meet the aggressor on his terms. If he is setting the field of battle right now, once you change the field, you can do what you want. But as of now, you're fighting on his turf. So in which case, you've got to learn some of his techniques. So, and you've got to beat him at that. That's what you have to do. But we have to, at some point, move the battle to our turf where he faces a disadvantage. That's what we need to do.
Quite right. And how do you look at the Savarkar definition of Hindutva in this context?
See, I think the problem is we tend to confuse race with something else, because in the Western idea, race is a specific type of ethnic group which is very limiting. So he calls Hindus a race. But I think broadly he's got it right in terms of the approach. That is, anybody who has his, sees this geographical area as his Pitrubhumi, Matrubhumi, everything, and who does not owe allegiance to anybody outside, can be considered a Hindu, and provided he respects all the things that happens. So even if it's a question of minorities in India, first thing that you need to ask them to do is that, can you respect the basic tenets on which this land was created, which became a sacred geography, according to Diana Eck. This was not a top-down religion. One fellow didn't found the religion and say that, okay, this is it. This is a ground-up religion. It grew from the soil of this territory. So how do you, if you do not respect what grew from the soil of this territory, you are basically saying, I'll inflict some alien thing and you have to respect that. No, you can't do that. So you've got to respect what this land respects. Then you are welcome to pursue your own faith. We have never opposed your faith. We have just said that you can't do what you want and do that. That's the basic point we need to accept about things. So I would say that the Savarkar idea is a good one, but it needs to be built on. You have to put flesh onto it. You need to define it in the modern context. He wrote it quite some time back, about nearly more than nearly 80, 90, 100 years ago. So that was the time he was talking about, when we were talking about a colonial period where he was trying to get Hindus to join the army, learn to be ability to fight, join. He opposed the 1942 movement because he says you must join the war and learn how to fight, because you've forgotten all that in the meanwhile, right? So he had many other ideas you need to take in. But I think we need to expand on that thought a little more and give it a modern context.
Yeah, mentioning about 1942 and mentioning about the Second World War, it also had a very practical outcome actually. If Savarkar had not urged the Hindus to join the army, later on Ambedkar analyzed at the time of the end of the Second World War, the Muslim element in the Indian army was 34%.
Right.
And if Savarkar had not got the Indian youth to join, it would probably have been 50%. And at that point of time, because I think the Indian National Congress grew cold feet also because they knew that 1/3 of the army was Muslim. And they did not have the stomach to fight that out. That was one of the reasons that they so meekly accepted partition. And if it had been 50%, then they might have even accepted the whole of Punjab and whole of Bengal going to Pakistan.
That's right. Correct.
So that's the practical dimension of Savarkar's exhortation.
We have a rose-tinted view of 1942, but it did not actually succeed. And that was an opportunity for people to learn to be a little more aggressive and fight a war and learn how to fight. And that was actually a turning point for many people. The ability to create an army on your own terms depended on many Indians joining the war. And Gandhi himself was very inconsistent on this. Occasionally he will aid a war effort, then he will oppose it. He was very inconsistent because even in his own pacifism. I mean, if you are such a pacifist, he shouldn't have joined the Boer War on the side of the things in terms of this thing. But he was aiding the war effort in any case, and he got a medal and all for that. So when it suits him, he would join a war effort. When it didn't suit him, he will not do so. So it was very, very inconsistent on this aspect. And certainly, I think Ambedkar, if you actually look at it, he was very clearly in his tract on Pakistan, very clearly said that, look, can you trust this army in a united this thing to defend your country if somebody, some Islamic force, and Gandhi, for example, made the same problem. He said, yes, I would expect that Indian Muslims to support the ruler of Afghanistan if he invades India. I mean, he said things like these things. I mean, what a ridiculous kind of statement to make, but that's the reality.
And not only that, I think it's not exactly the topic, but since we're talking 1942, the most interesting thing that I found in 1942 was that the 1942 Quit India movement was not on the question of the provinces getting the authority to secede. Because I think in April or May 1942, in the CWC meeting, Pattabhi Ramaiah moved a resolution, and it was passed by the CWC, giving the provinces the authority to secede. And Pattabhi Ramaiah apparently did it on the urging of Gandhiji. And ultimately, they went to a Quit India movement, not on this question, which should have been a life and death question for them. But they went to Quit India movement on the question of the defense of India remaining with the British. I mean, how ridiculous can you be?
That's right, correct. I think they just decided they had to do something and they just invented a reason for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what it was. So coming to your fifth reason, that's Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That's another one on which I have myself written quite a lot and also done a few videos. And let me first give my version, because yours is more rooted in the practical and pragmatic considerations. Mine is more philosophical in the sense that this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam was actually propounded as some kind of a discourse to Shukadevji, the son of Maharishi Vedavyas.
Okay.
And this is called a Mahopanishad. And it is there in Mahopanishad, and it's completely spiritual dimension. The dimension of this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is completely spiritual. And when it was, I think in the past, it must have been so that some people might have talked about it. and tried to use it in daily practice. And at that time, the Hitopanishad has come out with a story. It is the story of the deer Chitrangad, the crow, and the jackal Durbuddhi. And the story actually makes fun of this concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It shows that it is totally impractical.
Correct.
So on that, I've written and spoken a number of times.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what is your take, please?
Yeah, it's absolutely what you say it is. And I agree completely with your thing. At a philosophical level, we can treat all human beings, all living beings as your family also. But you cannot think of it when you're actually feeding your enemies. I mean, China comes and talks about Panchsheel agreement and all this crap. But basically, what are they doing? They are actually your enemy pretending to be your friend, exactly as in the Hitopadesa, I mean, if you are going to donate $50 billion every year as a trade deficit, you are essentially financing their aggression on you. So why would you do this? I mean, there is no question of world is a family here. This member of the family needs to be taught a lesson. There is no other way about it. So people who say, oh, no, but you must trade. Did Churchill trade with Hitler during the Second World War? No. He said, no, we can't. Even at a cost to ourselves, we have to see that we don't enrich this chap. Right? So this business of world is one family. No, the world is many families, and the interests of each family are not the same. And when one family actually turns out to be rogue, and that there are 3 rogue states today, all driven by the senior rogue and 2 junior rogues in Pakistan and North Korea. And if you think they are all part of the same family, till they change their mindsets, they can never be part of even the global family, leave alone the family in the Indian subcontinent. So I think that this is completely damaging to self-interest, to sort of think that you want to sacrifice yourself for the sake of the family, which is okay. If a mother sacrifices for her children, I can understand. You're talking about the future. But if you sacrifice yourself for nothing, just for the thing, then it doesn't make sense. So I think this Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is only at the philosophical level, and given goodwill on all sides, you can treat others as your family. When there is no goodwill, when there is an enemy, when somebody wants to destroy you, there is no question of using this concept to justify pacifism and stupidity.
Pacifism and stupidity. I think that's very well put. And also, let us discuss this ahimsa paramo dharma. Now, what is the definition of ahimsa that this ahimsa paramo dharma actually actuates?
Yeah, correct. See, if ahimsa was actually paramo dharma, you would expect your body to behave in the same way, right? So when it is attacked by bacteria or viruses, you should say ahimsa paramo dharma, let the virus eat me up, right? But your body creates antibodies. Yeah, your white blood corpuscles go on and create a dharma yuddha there to make sure that your body is safe, right? So where is the paramo dharma? Even in nature, it does not exist, because every living being has a right to fight back and survive, right? So ahimsa is useful only in the context of we have benign bacteria who help us. So we can practice the bacteria on your gut who helps digest your food. But you have to fight the bacteria who are going to fight you. So you got to make a difference. But with whom you practice ahimsa, it is not an all-embracing idea. It is an idea you embrace with people who are helpful to you. You have to discard it for people who are going to affect your chances of survival.
Right. And that's what I tell people. In fact, remember the Bhagavad Gita, in the 18th Adhyaya, the 17th shlok, which I think sums up the definition of ahimsa. And they say, yasya na hankrito bhavo, buddhir yasya na lipyate.
Right.
Yasya na hankrito bhavo, buddhir yasya na lipyate, hattvasa iman lokan na hanti na nibadyate. If you're not really involved in this and you do it out of a sense of duty, then it is not ahimsa. So you're not neither killing nor you're getting bound by the karma that is involved in that. So that is something that we are not taught. In fact, we are taught this Gandhian ahimsa, which is completely destroys our will to resist.
Correct.
And once the will is destroyed, the will to resist is destroyed.
Yeah, that's right.
Then
Correct.
I think everything goes off.
That's
And that
right.
is why I think some people say that there is a popular thing going on right now that said Hindutva is Hinduism that resists.
Correct.
And you cannot take this power of resistance or the will of resistance away from people.
Absolutely correct. And the Gita's simple message is this, that we tend to, I think these pacifists tend to promote Arjuna's doubt over Krishna's obvious message, which says, please fight, that's your duty. And instead of, they sow Arjuna's doubts in our minds without Krishna's benefit. So what we do is we say, yeah, pacifism must be good. After all, Arjuna came to the battle saying, I'm going to not fight my uncles and aunts and things like that, because I don't have the will to fight. Suddenly I turns a coward. Krishna says, you can't do that. Huh? It's your duty to go and resist, to fight and fight for dharma. So we should stop being children of Arjuna's doubt. We should be the children of Krishna's advice. That's what I feel is the one-line message that Gita tells all of us. Huh?
That's wonderful. Let's not be the children of Arjuna's doubt, but let's be the children of Krishna's advice. So on that note, I bring this conversation to an end. It's been wonderful talking to you, Jaggi sir. And we hope to have you here many more times because I think you pack a rare punch with rare clarity. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Please
Sanjay.
stay on. Please stay on.